everybody, and welcome to a meeting of the Audit Risk and Assurance Committee. This is an additional meeting we're holding in between our last meeting of January and our scheduled meeting of May, and it was intended to be to deal with a single item, but in fact we deal not just with one internal audit report, but with three, in a way that I think is going to be very helpful, because that actually distributes the load. So rather than having 6 internal audit reports coming to us in May, we're better distributed by having 3 now and 3 in May. So I'm certainly grateful to everybody who worked to make that possible. In the usual way, now be very familiar with this. This is a meeting which is being live streamed, so welcome not only to those who are on screen, but those who are, I hope, listening in, or indeed view this after the event. If my IT goes down, and there's a slight possibility it seems to be somewhat misbehaving this morning, I will ask Grant McRae to kindly take over. And if we move on then to the agenda in the normal way, are there any apologies? I think probably not. I would have had ahead of time. Any declarations of interest? No. And in the usual way, can I ask members if they agree to take the small number, in fact, I think only 2 minutes and 1 item in private? Thank you. Okay, so if we can then proceed, first of all, with the minutes of the January meeting, which have been circulated. Is everybody content with those? Content? I will take the answer as agreement. Thank you very much. The action log, I mean, there are a number of items which are proposed as ongoing. Can I just ask one on data quality and integrity? A briefing to be provided on the data ethics framework was an action from the last meeting, and indeed there was a presentation to all of the SPA board, which I think I know members found very interesting indeed. Suggested here as the next steps is a paper on data ethics to ARAC. I think that is certainly of interest in the sense of process, but I also know that this is a topic of wider interest to the board. So just what was the thinking on that, and or the timing on that? Can anybody enlighten me on that? Who does this response come from, as it were? John, have you any insight into that? Or if not, perhaps you could, we could just take that away and think about how the board can be best informed, not just ARAC.
Yes, Chair. I think we're going to propose to have a look at that and come back to you. Okay. Content with that? Yes. Okay. Thanks. Whistleblowing, I don't think this one. Whistleblowing, we have an update. Yes, I think we need to keep an eye on that. That's a bit vague as to dates. So perhaps, can anybody tell me, Police Scotland will engage with People in Development in relation to whistleblowing being incorporated into brackets, any brackets, new staff surveys. I wasn't quite sure about the significance of the brackets, whether that meant there were going to be no staff surveys or there was one or many scheduled. Any information on that? James?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. All that I can say is that I can take an action here to go away and get clarification around that and provide an updated written response.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. And the Audit and Improvement Tracker, indeed, it will be interesting to see in May what progress with that. Content? Anything else out of the action log? Okay, so we move on then to the first of the 3 internal audit reports. And as I said, I think it's very helpful indeed to have 3, not just 1, and therefore a better distribution over our meetings. And so Gary Devner from Assets. Gary, are you going to introduce this first one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the first report from internal audit is the strategic planning report, and this was well trailed at the last committee meeting, but just to talk through the key findings. So what we found was that Police Scotland and the SPA had been working really hard on developing strategic planning frameworks, and that they had implemented largely robust frameworks for strategic planning overall. So we conclude that those arrangements are generally robust and working well. Within that context, we did find that the translation of those strategic plans into operational plans was less good and certainly patchy in places. So it was hard to find a clear line of sight between the strategic objectives and the execution of those strategic objectives into operational plans. So how management and the organisation and the board understand whether their strategy is on track, on time, on budget across the complex operational plans within a body like a police force was difficult and challenging. And also to be able to implement mitigating actions to address strategies that look as though they're going off course, perhaps not on track, on time, on budget, be able to intervene and know when to do that. So it's linked a little bit to the developments of the performance management framework. Also within that context, we found that some parts of Police Scotland were operating better in that area than others. So fleet services, for example, tended to have much better operational planning processes than, say, you would find in environmental or cyber or some other part of business where there was where it was more difficult to find that lack of clarity. So it's not a one-size-fits-all report. We are finding that it's good in parts, but certainly overall the key findings that we are identifying and improving that operational planning processes do apply across the board, even in the context that some areas are doing better than others. I think you will also see the management responses to the action plan, and that's a joint management response between the SPA and Police Scotland, because there are 2 elements to this. There is the Police Scotland element of implementing the operational plans, and then the SPA element of how they oversee the accountability for how those plans are being managed. And I think Police Scotland and the SPA have managed to reach a consensus of how that will work going forward. Some of the detail on how that will work is yet to be, you can probably see from the report, is not entirely clear in the detail, but I do understand that they do have good arrangements now for managing that process. I think that's all I would want to say on this report. I'm sure you've all read it and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Yes, it was the most interesting report. I must say, I mean, I welcome the clarity of the conclusion, certainly. I think it was not entirely easy to say exactly how far the recommendations and particularly the management actions address the conclusion, as it were. So I think that's probably what members are going to be interested in, is both about the recommendations and particularly about the management action and the content. But perhaps before we go through the report in detail, I think there was one thing contextually, because and Grant, I know you particularly wanted to ask around this, around the timing issues, and in other words, how current this conclusion and actions are. Grant.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, basically, as I understand it, the field work on this has been on the go for quite a wee while, and that's why we didn't actually get the report to the last meeting. So I wonder if, Gary, you could say a little bit more about when the work was done. What really has it taken such a long time to get this report finalised, because of a lot of discussion and disagreement in terms of what it finally contains, and because it's being presented now, are the findings still, in your belief, still current, or have things moved on a bit? Because there's references, for example, to the next police plan coming on in a couple of weeks' time. So I'm just trying to sort of understand the timeline and the way forward.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. I think that is a really important question. So we undertook the work in November and December. We had a largely agreed draft report at that point, so just before Christmas break. The factual points within the report have largely remained unchanged. The issue for management, and really it's for management to explain to the committee this part, but it was around the management response. So how should Police Scotland and the SPA coordinate an effective response to the operational issues that we were raising, the operational planning issues? And that is a delicate issue, and that has taken a little bit of time and engagement between both the SPA and Police Scotland to find their way through that. So the hold-up was not a delay in the actual detail of the report. That's largely remained unchanged. You are right, though. So we agreed the management responses just shortly before the committee. So those are current, and I think in that context, I think you can say that the big thrust of the report around operational planning is unlikely to have changed significantly in the timeline. So I'm confident that this report is timely, and the real issues in it are unchanged. But I do think it's for management to explain how they intend to take the recommendations forward.
Thanks, Gary. That's extremely helpful. Thank you. And I suppose, Jean, it's a matter of getting management's views on that as we work our way through the report.
Absolutely. And I think I am particularly interested, as you pull out, if it is about operational, it's line of sight and accountability for the SPA. It's not for the SPA to be devising the operational planning. And I wonder if we're, sufficiently clear about that, because it is, as you rightly say, Gary, a line of sight. I think that's fine. So perhaps we should just walk through the report. There are just 4 control objectives, so there's a section you can deal with each. But before we do that, perhaps I'll just then invite my other 2 committee members, Katrina and Katerina, if there's any general question, and particularly as we move forward, perhaps general questions directed to the management response. Katrina, you had your hand up first. I know.
So it was around the management response that I wanted to raise a question, I suppose. I mean, it isn't. Yeah, the actual implementation obviously is the responsibility of the Policing Performance Committee rather than the ARAC committee. But as Chair said, it's about our role as being able to have that oversight. And I guess there's a couple of things that I'm concerned about, or I would like to kind of raise, and that is to do with well, there's a couple of things, and you kind of pointed to it really, Gary, in your report there. It's how do all these different aspects of the strategic planning mesh together? So we've got people, we've got workforce, we've got finances. It's not actually that clear how these elements all work together, and I'm wondering whether it's possible to get some kind of a schematic, a diagram, or something that makes it really, really clear how all these different areas actually work together. The other thing I wanted to raise was around how do we know that the management response is going to take us in the direction that we want? How do we actually articulate the clear strategic outcomes? How do we evaluate those? So how do we know that we're doing what we need to do to get to where we want to be? Would be those are my 2 questions.
I mean, maybe if I could answer first for internal audit, and then management may have a comment on that. So my challenge to the audit team when we received the management responses was, how do we provide a follow-up report to the audit committee which tells you whether or not that's been implemented? Yeah. And I mean, it's not for us to put the management response in, and what we wanted to do is get the report to you. And I do think that there has been lots of really positive, constructive discussions. But you are right. Some kind of schematic would give you a lot more comfort and assurance on how it comes together to ensure that the objectives of the recommendation are met. But perhaps management will be better placed to explain how they intend to do that.
Yeah, by all means. And Tom and Amanda, a schematic is interesting, but I felt that the thrust of your conclusion, Gary, was that things were patchy, good in some areas, but not necessarily in others. And it wasn't entirely clear whether it was the lack of clarity or simply the absence of implementation plans was the issue. And for me, I think both.
I thought, Chair, that what they needed was a framework for operational planning that all operational plans had to comply to. So a minimum standard of operational planning that enforced minimum standards of line of sight. So success criteria and KPIs and milestones and all of these key elements of program and project management. And if you have those key elements, then they all come up to the same minimum standard.
Yeah.
And that should give you some assurance.
Yeah. And on the line of sight issue, it's not, I suppose, it's indeed not a management response within the document, but exactly as you'd said, how does SPA have line of sight? I mean, it seems to me there is a question: what is the extent to which we, the SPA, should be approving major strategies without at least an indicative implementation plan attached? That you don't just approve a strategy in the abstract, but there needs some formality around either an implementation plan at the time or a time-limited commitment to when you produce the implementation plan. That seems to me an oversight issue for the board when we're talking major strategies. So now I've got so many hands up, but I feel I ought to probably at this point allow some management response to that. So Tom or Kirsty Louise, I think. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If you don't mind, I'll invite Kirsty to come in afterwards. So the conversation, I'll take firstly the point about a schematic. I mean, that's something that we've supplied to Andrew in conducting the audit in terms of the line of sight. And actually, my overview of this report is that it was almost wholly positive. I mean, we have one amber recommendation and a number of greens there and a couple of yellows. The point about implementation planning, if that's the source of concern, which is completely legitimate, is that I think the management response is intended to cover exactly what you've described, Gary, that we do acknowledge that we need to get that better, that I think we've got the means to approach it properly. We've got the MOU in place, which is alluded to in terms of that relationship with SPA. And ultimately, it's the benefit of having the audit having been done, that actually myself and Kirsty Louise have been able to surface a conversation within Police Scotland about what depth of implementation planning needs to have been done in order to surface a strategy. So I think you can take it as read that we're committed to doing that. And I think there's a different question almost about whether the SPA would be signing off strategies if they were dissatisfied with the implementation plan. I think that takes us into old kind of constitutional territory about where the lines are drawn between the SPA's role as a strategic body and Police Scotland's role in terms of management and implementation. So I'll kind of park that. But my take on it was that the response is intended to give you exactly the assurance that I'm hearing you're looking for, that we will look very seriously at how we make sure that there are robust implementation plans. And in truth, a very first step and the opportunity to do that is with the review of the joint strategy that's currently underway between Police Scotland and the SPA, which again was positively reflected in the report. So I'm hopeful that the range of recommendations I've interpreted them as really quite positive, and our responses are intended to address what is the central message where we do need to improve around implementation planning. Could I maybe ask, Chair, with your forbearance, that Kirsty comes in and just gives a perspective?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that the audit itself was around the strategic planning framework. So the findings that I see within the audit on strategic planning are that there is a sound framework there. Our strategy is fully aligned with government policy, statute and other areas. There's a section there that talks about the value and the breadth and good practice around research, insight and engagement that underpin the tools, etc. And some minor points around when we review the strategic planning framework and how that's visible and etc. So the key issue that's coming out of this is around operational planning. So that's the implementation that sits underneath the strategic planning framework with our business areas and change function, and how all of that would come together. And I think that we've wholeheartedly agreed, and throughout the audit kind of had really rich conversations with audit and SPA, that how we translate the strategic plans, so from strategy to the Chief Constable's annual police plan, into what the change portfolio brings and what business area brings, is the next stage in our maturing journey from a strategic planning framework into operational planning. And I think that's part of where the organisations come from. What the audit maybe doesn't tell us is that strategy, planning, insight, these are all functions that were only built in Police Scotland in the last few years as part of transformation. So it was only in 2019 that Police Scotland co-designed and developed the outcomes and objectives and the strategic planning framework, and from then many of the enabler strategies that you see there. We've been working really hard on the performance framework to align with that. And now we're in a place on that maturing journey where we can get into the layer below and really start to look at and work together with the business and change on those operational plans. So I hope that's a kind of helpful wider context, which sometimes doesn't come through in the audit, but very much the organisation's been on a journey to build our capability, to build our capacity, and actually to culturally shift Police Scotland to work to outcomes as opposed to kind of linear crime-focused objectives. Thank you.
No, thank you, Kirsty. I think that's very helpful. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the SPA should get into operational planning. What I'm saying is that it's that point that Gary drew out, what's the line of sight, and that others have drawn out. How do we know, essentially,
Yes.
that this is happening, and what's the route to that? So it's in that context now.
Can I just come back very briefly, Chair? Is that okay?
Yes, all right, Katrina.
Thank you. Well,
Yes.
just I wanted to absolutely clarify. I thought that was really, really interesting. That is really helpful to have a bit of the context. As someone who's only been on the board for a year. Gosh, is it that long already? Anyway, I think it's probably worth saying that this is something that I raise often anyway, because as a researcher, I have a bit of a thing about evaluation and ensuring that there are good routes to evaluating that whatever is done actually achieves what it's trying to achieve. So so just to put that in context as well, it's just something I always would like to see, is that evaluation process. So thank you very much. It was really helpful.
That was Katerina, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating debate. We've, I think, already touched on most of the things that kind of were going through my head as well. I just wanted to say, I mean, Tom, I agree with you. I also look at this internal audit report, and I do think there is a lot of positives that are coming out in the conclusion and in some of the observations. So, it certainly from one perspective, it does give me a fair degree of confidence around the strategic planning element of it. At the same time, and I think Kirsty Louise has described it really perfectly and kind of put this into context. There is, we all know that the strategy is only as good as the implementation plans that sit below that, and fully appreciate that you're still on a journey in terms of the maturing element of that. I suppose my kind of words of wisdom on this is
what I'm trying to square up is this what we've just heard from Tom and Kirsty Louise, that yeah, absolutely, you know, we are moving into the more the maturing, the next kind of level below strategic planning. But I don't necessarily see that coming through in the management actions in this report. You know, particularly I was just, you know, kind of quite agreeing with Gary when he was saying that ideally what, you know, as an auditor, what you would want to see, or even as an oversight body from an SPA's perspective, what we would like to see possibly is this minimum standards around it's that operational planning framework. So minimum standards, what goes into an implementation plan, at what stage, what goes into it, you know, the links back to evaluation that Katrina has just been talking about. Because in my experience, you know, and again, I keep looking at the management action, you know, and it talks about, well, business areas have got the responsibility for that, but there's room to clarify. In my experience, is if you leave these elements to different business functions to do, business areas to do their own planning without that planning framework, you know, at a relatively detailed level, you end up, you know, you end up with a variety of sort of different qualities in implementation planning, which is, I think, exactly what we've seen through this audit. And we certainly, as an audit and risk committee, have seen through the individual internal audit reports that have been coming to us over the course of the last year, you know, because that seems to be that sort of an ongoing thing around, well, you know, implementation. There's great degree of variability just in terms of detail and the quality. And that's not to say that there needs to be a one size fits all, but certain minimum criteria kind of need to be embedded. And I also think that, you know, again, from experience, if there isn't that framework, then effectively some of the variability is not necessarily due to a lack of ambition within a business area, but also it depends on the resources that you have within that business area. So, you know, so I hear the sentiment. I agree that this isn't a hugely damning report, but it clearly highlights the room for improvement. And I just don't see the sentiment that has just been expressed to us necessarily accurately reflected in the management action. So that's kind of where the disconnect is for me. And maybe if you just one more thought, I think the role of the SPA. So we've been challenged that absolutely, I don't think we want to get into a position where the SPA is saying, oh, well, we're not signing off on a strategy unless there's a detailed implementation plan and we're okay with the implementation plan. I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about knowing that there are processes within Police Scotland that are robust enough that if, you know, you tell us there is an implementation plan in place and it's going to be, it's aligned to strategy, then we've got the confidence that that's all we need to know to some degree, and we don't need to delve into the operational element of it because you guys are all over it. So that's just, apologies for a very long-winded kind of position on this.
Okay, I think what's coming out from this, and I don't think there's any disagreement at all from the committee members, including myself, is not the delving into the detail of the operational, but just that how do we know how are we going to be properly cited of this, both as the SPA, well, you internally for starters, that the work that Tom and Kirsty Louise are doing internally, how that's going to be visible at the right points to your internal change control and management, to assets in terms of being able to report to us on how this is proceeding in the normal way of your follow-up reporting to ARAC, because that's an absolute level of assurance, and just how the committee can then provide assurance to the board, but be assured. And I think maybe, and we might reflect on this when we get to the end, because I think we just should look through the various control objectives, but just what's the follow-up? And is there something in terms of some milestone reporting in the way we've done with actually previous internal audit plans? And that's been a very useful way, I think, of doing it, rather than waiting until, I don't know, a year or two's time for a formal follow-up internal audit. But so some
some citing and tracking as we go along, I think might be the way to do it, because most of them are either 1 or 2 are complete or a 1-year action, and it's something about the middle distance between now and 1-year action and follow up. So I think that's how I'm going to suggest we approach it, subject to, I've got Grant has his hand up, and somebody whom I can't actually identify and is going to have to speak out, have their hand up after Grant.
Thank you, Jane. I think the other hands that I see are Andrew Diffin and Amanda Coulthart.
Right. Okay.
Hands up. But basically, all I was really want to say is, Tom and Kirsty Louise, I do see exactly where you've got the framework in place. But as Gary touched on the fact that there's sort of variability further down the line, and I just wonder if, in fact, the way you are able to monitor how everything is being progressed from right down to operations, whether in fact you've put a sort of scheme in place that gives, say, smart objectives in place so that you know what's being achieved and what's not being achieved at the pace you'd like to see it. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that this committee or any other committee would wish to drill down into that. We just would, it'd be helpful to know if you had that in place so that you're able to actually oversee what's working well and what needs further assistance, if I put it that way, to actually make sure that when it comes up to the surface at the top, it's actually achieving what you set out to do.
Chair, can I come in?
Tom, yes, by all means.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Grant. And just reflecting back, I think we're actually all furiously agreeing, because we agree with that recommendation. And we're keen and will benefit exactly from the advice that you're giving us about how best to address it. And I can give you the assurance it is a conversation that this audit has surfaced much more directly inside Police Scotland about how we go about implementation planning. The point, Grant, about tracking progress, that there's a number of means by which that's currently done, but I think probably they could be revisited in the context of this recommendation. So each of the DCCs has a management group, and they have their own 3-year plan that captures all of the activity that they've committed to across various programmes and projects aligned to the strategies. And ultimately it's left to the DCCs to track progress there. But equally, colleagues will be well aware, we have the change board. We have a large change function that drives transformation activity and oversees and provides resources to the various programmes and projects. And they have a reporting responsibility as well to track progress, to give RAG status and so on. But I think all of that work would benefit from taking some account of this audit recommendation, just exactly as you are proposing. So I think we're in absolutely the same place. Thank you.
And particularly if the strategies are cross-cutting and are not simply at individual DCC level, because so many of them will be cross-cutting. I mean, Gary mentioned, for instance, cyber, which touches each and every aspect. So, yes, okay. So can I, before we move through the report itself, which I think will be all the more informed by this general debate, and therefore maybe swifter, to the 2 people who do have their hands up who haven't contributed yet, and one is Amanda Coulthart, who of course is the SPA staff member who is most closely involved in this. So Amanda,
Thank you, Chair. I think just assurance to members around the SPA officer support to this work and the approach that we are taking to supporting oversight and scrutiny from members of the work. As Tom and Kirsty Louise have already described, that there is a strong partnership working approach to the review of the strategic police plan and further work, and that's described in the management actions. I think just to pick up on a couple of points that have been made, and one that was made by Gary in introduction, the strategic planning framework that's described at the moment does deliver that schematic that Katrina mentioned, describing both the strategic priorities that sit at government level, the outcomes that are described in the strategic police plan, and then those enabling strategies that support delivery of that. What it doesn't do is provide that minimum standard that's been described and discussed a lot by members already around what you need in order to assure that a strategy can be delivered and how they all fit together. And what we don't have is something that describes that alignment at the moment. As we work through the review of the strategic police plan, it is absolutely our shared intention that will be enhanced further, and that's clear in the management actions. I think we need to be very clear about what our support can be to that as an SPA. And I think it is, as Gary described, a description of what would be helpful in terms of monitoring, oversight and scrutiny. So as you said, Chair, it's not about getting into the operational detail at all in terms of what's reported to committee, but it's understanding direction of travel and being able to assess a level of evidence in order to provide that oversight and scrutiny. And what is described in the report as patchy at the moment is the detail around evidence. So there are strong strategies in place that don't necessarily describe how you would evidence success at the end point of delivery, and what we need is a consistent approach to that. And I think the cyber strategy is a great example. So Policing Performance Committee probably see more operational detail than other committees do because of the nature of the business. So the cyber strategy and supporting implementation plan have been through Policing Performance Committee. And I think members of that committee have been, have their understanding of delivery and some of the success factors has been enhanced through seeing that implementation plan. I think linked to that, the discussion that Policing Performance Committee have on the annual police plan and how they can provide that oversight and scrutiny around the delivery of the annual police plan has focused on ensuring that there are milestones and delivery dates in there, and real detail of what success looks like around the activities that are described. And I know that next year's annual police plan is due to be considered by board next week, and I think you will see the benefit of the feedback that's been provided through committee and what is a really positive and responsive annual police plan presented next week. But it is that ongoing discussion about ensuring there is a sufficient level of detail around evidence and delivery to support member scrutiny while not providing an operational level of detail that's not appropriate to be considered by members. And we will continue to work with our colleagues in Police Scotland to ensure that we find that balance for members as we work through the implementation of the management actions that have been described for the audit.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing that plan, the papers which should be published in the next day or so. So that will be very helpful, and we might then reflect at the end on on the next stage, the next milestone for this committee. In light of that, is going to be a helpful thing to do. And Andrew Diffin, you have your hand up. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. I had a number of points of detail I wanted to pick up on, but I think largely management have covered most of those as they've made the points they were raising. I think what you've probably received there is a bit of a summary of the detailed discussion that was ongoing in the process of trying to finalise this report. I'll just probably add, I think, one more comment, which I think goes to the point that Kirsty Louise made regarding the relatively recent introduction of the strategic planning capacity capability within Police Scotland. And I say relatively recent, and what I mean is relative to the lifespan of some of the strategies that we're talking about. So I think it's fair to say that Tom and Kirsty Louise have had a kind of a dual purpose job. They have both been developing new strategies, looking at new issues, developing issues, and how the police service is going to progress. But they've also had the job of trying to corral a number of existing strategies and strategic documents which have been developed by different people under different processes and so on and so forth. So I did want to make the observation that certainly in the course of our work, we did see significantly more consistency in approach through to the well-defined process that we see now over the last couple of years. The last point I'll make is, and I'll be brief, to do with the point around implementation planning. I think the focus of the committee there is the correct one. It's about how do you receive assurance on this, and the big part of that is how do the implementation plans that are put together interface with the performance reporting arrangements. So there is a performance framework there. The connections between that performance framework and the implementation plans that are currently in place are a bit inconsistent and generally there, but quite complex. So largely, I think the exercise is around simplifying, surfacing that detail for the committee.
Okay, thank you. I wonder then if I could throw open a question, which you may have, somebody may have the answer now, and certainly by the end of the meeting. Given that I can absolutely see that about improving and much easier and more straightforward and all the rest of it with new strategies rather than trying to retrofit to existing. What is there, apart from the annual policing plan coming, is there a new strategy hoving into view that we can expect to be the exemplar of what we wish to see as the new approach? I mean, I think that's quite a helpful thing to just have in mind, you know, so that if in 6 months' time there is a refresh of a particular strategy, that would give us a really good milestone. Question mark. Kirsty Louise, Tom, do you?
If I can go first, if that's okay, and I'll let Kirsty come in. I would only reference the work that's in train just now, Chair, around an equality, diversity and inclusion strategy for the service.
Okay.
And also a more operational strategy around tackling violence against women and girls, which members have raised with us in other contexts. So I think they would be good test cases almost.
Yeah.
The development of the implementation planning.
Yeah.
Exactly as Katerina has described, with those really clear, and actually it's not that difficult to do, almost pro forma approach as to what the milestones are going to be and how we're going to track progress. The link across to performance framework, I think that's a discussion we can pick up as well. But those would be my two live examples, and I don't know, Kirsty, if you wanted to add anything on that.
No, I think both those examples are absolutely in that direction. So I think that would be helpful for us to look at. I also think it would be helpful to understand we have been connecting all our strategies and plans to the outcomes focused performance framework. So everything that we do in terms of strategy and planning sits within the outcomes and objectives that we see in the strategic police plan and the joint strategy. So I think there's a really helpful debate there about how we would like to see progress reporting on operational planning, whether you want to see that holistically within the performance framework, or how the different mechanisms, for example, change, etc., can come together to give you that assurance. So I think potentially it's not just the operational plan element that you would want to look at, it's how you get assurance from both the performance framework and other mechanisms in one place to show progress against strategies and plans.
And I think ARAC will have a view, and other committees and the whole board will have a view. I mean, it's not, that is not just a decision for ARAC, but I think if we could capture that point about equality, diversity and violence against women, and I think those are such current and live and important issues that it would have a dual benefit, as it were. This is not simply an academic exercise, but it is something to ensure that topics of acute interest are handled to absolutely the optimum and become the exemplar for how we can do others. So I put it to committee members. I think that would be a hugely welcome way of approaching that, and I do see nodding of heads actually. So I think if we could capture that, that would be really, really valuable. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So shall we then due diligence on the report itself, having had a very good discussion around it, and just look at the control objectives, the recommendations, the management actions, and just our committee members content with that, and particularly, which is something we always look at, the timeline that we're looking at. So if we do that, we will have covered much of the ground already, but the objective is that strategic plans are prepared according to a coherent framework appropriate to the structure and the needs. And we've talked about about that. Gary, do you want to say anything around the findings and the recommendation before we move to management action?
No, Chair. I think they speak for themselves. I think it's been really helpful to listen to Tom and Kirsty Lees about how they plan to implement that in practice, and I'm encouraged by the progress that Police Scotland have made in the last 2 years in putting strategic planning framework in place. And if they carry on that with the implementation planning, I would think that the committee could have strong assurance that they will land. So, you know, if they implement these improvements, then that will meet the objectives of the ARAC and the board and management team in Police Scotland. I do have confidence in that. I don't have anything to add to the action plan or the responses that I haven't already said.
Yeah. So, colleagues, any queries on the management action, which to some extent we've covered, and the timeline? And this one is rather more about the strategic plans than the implementation side of it. This control objective. Are colleagues content with that, subject to when we come back to it? I think so. How do we get that, as it were, interim assurance that we're on track? Is something I think to come back to. Anything to add to this one? Content as it stands? Grant, you look poised to speak.
Yes, apologies for it if I look poised to speak. There's just one aspect of how we roll this forward into annual reports, and I know Tom and others will be giving this some thought. Some of the things that are being talked about is having an action date by April 2023, and I don't have a problem with the principle of that at all. I was just thinking that when we come to report as an SPA, as an organisation, in the 22-23 annual report, which will be published in the summer of 2023, I think it would be helpful to be able to articulate how far we've got in developing the strategy and how it's working out. And I'm sure that the flow of information that's being gathered will help to do that.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean for the document which we will be considering to sign off in September, in effect?
In a year hence?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, a year hence, right.
Yes.
Okay. No, that's a good point to note. Okay.
I know that that Martin Evans, as chair of the organisation, is keen to see earlier reporting on what's actually being achieved. So, because there's an awful lot of moving parts in the organisation, and actually being able to report positively as to the progress, and actually being quite clear about what limiting factors there might be, not just finance, but resources of all sorts in actually delivering what people want to do. It's just a matter of just making sure that the information flow allows that to be borne in mind.
Sorry, so I may have misunderstood you. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with the earliest possible reporting, and so that your accounts are nearer in real time than some 18 months perhaps out of date. So that applies, does it not, to what might go in the annual report for 2021-2, given that we have this report within this reporting year?
Oh,
So
indeed. Sorry if I'm causing any
yes.
confusion.
Yeah.
I think that will certainly be something that we'd expect to see in the 21-22 report, but some of the things that are being put in place will have the real benefits flowing through in 22-23 as shown here. So I was thinking ahead to the report for 22-23 being able to say, this is what we plan to do, this is what's in progress, and how well it's working out or whatever.
Well, that's why I think it's really important to have some way of tracking as we go along through, you're absolutely right, 22-23, so that we can, since the completion date for these is the 1st of April 23, we should be able at that date to say complete, done. I'm sure it will be.
Precisely.
Yeah, okay. However, what it will, yes, it will be. And
Amanda, who wants to add to this?
Thanks, Chair. Just to provide assurance around the process for the development of the annual report and accounts document for both the upcoming document and for next year's. We are very mindful of the feedback from internal audit, from Audit Scotland and from members of this committee about ensuring that the analysis that's provided in terms of performance is as up to date and reflective of current activity as possible. And we are very mindful of describing direction of travel, even if a piece of work has not been concluded as yet. And hopefully you'll see that reflected in the draft that's developed for this year.
Thank you. That's very helpful indeed. Tom, you had your hand up, but I think it's come down again. No, it hasn't.
I'll put it back up, Chair. Thank you. Amanda, I think, has largely covered the point. It was simply to say that the Chief Constable under the Act makes a submission to the authority with his assessment of performance, and that is what informs and is discussed at the Performance Committee, and that's what informs then the annual report and accounts. So we'll make sure that it contains reference to these commitments. And I do think as well, Grant's right, it will be a year before we could say that we've fulfilled that. But I think we could certainly make clear the commitment to improved implementation planning in the year to come.
That will be exceptionally welcome. Yeah, okay, we'll hold you to that. Thank you. Right, so control objective 2. What we're looking for is that strategic planning process is clearly defined with clear allocation and assignment of responsibilities. Gary, I don't know if you want to say anything about...
No, nothing to add, Chair.
No,
no, nothing to add. Chair, I don't think we would add anything to anything that we've written, so we would stand by what we've written.
Yeah. And so there's a management action which certainly relates to the review of the joint strategy, and then engagement is agreed. Further discussion will be undertaken to consider setting this out in more detail, provide greater assurance, for which the due date is the 31st of May. Can you perhaps tease that out a little bit? That's quite a an action to have further discussion isn't hugely precise, or it's just precise. You will have further discussion, but I suppose what's going to be the outcome is the issue. Like to tease that out a little, Tom?
I was actually going to invite Kirsty to come in, if that's okay, just on the detail of that, okay. Kirsty.
Kirsty?
Thank you. I think that recommendation was to ask SPA and Police Scotland between ourselves to have a kind of clear understanding of how we'd be working together on the strategic police plan. So I'm guessing our management action, we're confirming that there is a review process that's been fully agreed and is underway between Police Scotland and SP. Joint teams working together, Director and Barry Sillers on the SPA side overseeing with strong engagement. I know that your cells were updated at a recent board session as well. So what we took from the recommendation was that the auditors were looking for us to have a clearly agreed approach that was joint to review and develop the strategic police plan. And we're confirming that we do have that in place and we're following it just now. On enabler strategies, I think that the recommendation was looking for us to have more of an agreed process on engagement on each of the enabler strategies. From our perspective in the last couple of years, we have done a lot of work engaging with the board on different strategies that we've developed. We also worked with you on your own forensic strategy. So the purpose of that is just to agree with SPA officers and others that we will have a more formal route of that engagement. That's already underpinned in the Memorandum of Understanding between SPA and Police Scotland. Therefore, every time we now go ahead to create a new strategy where we feel there's a gap from our evidence base, we are in contact with SPA colleagues and we have those discussions about the strategy, how it's been designed and developed, and how we would seek to engage with SPA as that is developed on its way through. Good example of that's the recent discussions on violence against women and girls, which is a strategy that's been developed this year. So I think what we're flagging up in the recommendation is we feel we've largely got those processes in place. However, we do want to continue to discuss and work together to make sure that they're right and to make sure that that SP visibility and connection to the enabler strategies from Police Scotland in particular are what you would hope, expect and feel that you're able to contribute in the way that you would like to. And I hope that kind of covers where we were going in our response to that recommendation.
I see that, and I see there's a lot of good work, etc., and things. It's just I'm relating it back to an internal audit report which says SPA and Police Scotland should agree, which indicates that the evidence was either wasn't happening, although I think it possibly is happening, and that rather it is, as you say in the management action, setting this out in more detail. Do you see there's a little bit of a mismatch between what the recommendation is and being entirely happy? Because if everyone was entirely happy, I don't think it would be there as a recommendation.
Well, we're happy to set out in detail how we would do that. I don't have any difficulty at all with that. What I would just say is that each of the enabler strategies are very different, and they are in times quite operational for Police Scotland. So if we can put in place an agreed framework for engagement, then we would be able to be agile within that for each of the individual strategies. On the particular point, and my understanding was the audit raised was ensuring that Police Scotland and SP had a shared approach to look at the strategic police plan, and we can confirm and have in the management action that that is agreed and in place.
Well, perhaps I've misunderstood this. Gary, just tease out that recommendation.
Yes, Chair. I mean, this comes back a little bit to the issue that I was raising in the management response, and it's really good to hear Kirsty Lees's response, because actually the way that that's been framed is the type of detailed auditors like a detailed response that says, by this date, we will have worked with the SPA and we will have agreed a framework of principles that enable that describe how we're going to work together. And some of that is in place. Kirsty Lees is right, but it's not a management response of that more exact type, I think would benefit the committee and benefit follow-up from internal audit. And it sounds like it's there. It's just how you articulate it, maybe in the how it's articulated in the report.
Yeah, the evidence base. Amanda, anything to add to that? Yes, Amanda.
Yeah, I think, Chair, as Kirsty Louise has described, we do have an approach, and I think what's come out of the recommendation is that approach is not written down in a level of detail that would provide the assurance. It is very much agreed, and as has been described, we have a strong joint team across both organisations in terms of the review of the strategic police plan. And I think Kirsty's already made the commitment, and we certainly support it to maybe just document that in a way that would provide that assurance to members that the detail has been delivered. I think it does pick up on the point that's been made a few times in the discussion about minimum standards, and Gary's just mentioned principles. I don't think it's a detailed process, because as has been described, the enabling strategies vary significantly in terms of detail and focus. But if we can work to describe something that builds on the memorandum of understanding in terms of engagement and touch points and process, then absolutely, I think that would be helpful for committee in terms of discharging that action.
I think my suggestion is it needs very, very little adjustment at all to the management action in light of this. It is that in that final sentence, rather than the further discussion will be undertaken to consider setting this out, it's actually a further discussion will be undertaken to set this out in more detail. That's all you need to do, and your time limit, your 31st of May, given that you've got all of this in place, I think you can easily meet that. That would be my suggestion. We content to accept that?
Yep, that's
resonate
fine.
with members?
That's fine, Chair.
Happy with that,
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you very much. The third objective, which is indeed green, which is the thing, the finding is green. Strategic planning is informed by consultation with a range appropriate range of stakeholders, the public, consideration of actual and potential future developments in the public and political spheres. And here I think we can all acknowledge that things have come on leaps and bounds in even the time I've been on the board. So the recommendation is a coordination of future plans for research and horizon scanning, just to make sure there's no duplication or conflict. It does say a shared approach, so that it sounds as though you've taken the management action even in advance of reporting to the committee. Anybody like to? Amanda.
Yeah, I think this is a real area of success, Chair, and does predate the work of the internal audit. The shared approach that's been developed through Kirsty Louise and Scott Ross on behalf of the SPA was work that predates the audit, but very much fits with the aspirations of what was described in the recommendations. And I think it is a shared approach. It recognises the different needs of both organisations, but aligns the approach where it's appropriate to do so.
Okay. Tom, Kirsty Louise, and then I think Katrina, you've got your hand up, I think. Oh, yeah. No, sorry, I thought I saw that. Tom?
Thanks, Chair. Amanda has covered it. This is a shared process that actually in 2021 we were in the stages of developing, and I think that's ultimately why it's been recorded as green. So I'm happy to record as a management action that's work underway and it's working.
Well, it's done. I couldn't say. I mean, that is the approach is agreed, and it's how that rolls out. Actually, that's, as always, interested in the outcome of that. Yeah, Katrina.
Yes, no, I just really pleased to see that there. I'm sorry, this is probably slightly out of sync, and I hope it's not already been covered, but just a bit of clarity in the Appendix B for the summary of the management actions. Is so 1.1 strategic framework, an updated strategic planning framework is being published on the 1st of April 2022, and then under due date it's got 1st of April 2023, and I just wanted to clarify, is that something's being published, it's being published this year and then being updated next year, or is that a typo?
Tom?
Chair, thank you. No, it's not a typo, Katrina. It's the annual police plan, which we'll publish and submit to Parliament. Obviously, the authority will see it next week. Will have the strategic planning framework within it, and we've made a point of referencing that, which I hope actually will fulfil some of the appetite, if you like, for a schematic as well, as to how there's the line of sight from government priorities through to our enabler strategies and the plans below them. And as part of the review of the joint strategy, the work we're doing jointly with your officers, we will revisit that, and the product, the next iteration of the joint strategy that will appear in approximately a year's time should have the most up-to-date version. So it's not a typo, but it's a fair challenge.
Yeah, no, it was just, yeah, that's great. Thanks very much indeed.
I think, because actually, funny enough, I'd noted that, I think, again, if you're amending it at all, it is consideration of the strategic planning framework rather than the current strategic planning framework, because that's where the ambiguity arises as to what in that case is current. Yeah, okay. Right. Thank you. So we move on to number 4, which is in a sense the thing we have been at the heart of what we've been discussing. So we may feel we've covered it adequately. There are adequate arrangements to implement, monitor and report on the delivery of strategic objectives. This is the essence of this is around implementation. And so we know that we've had that discussion. This is the management action, which I think we have been covering, but any further reflections, and is there any sense in which we can adjust in any way, if we need to, the management action for clarity about what is going to happen between now and the 1st of April 2023. I think the issue, we've talked about measures of success. Scope to clarify within Police Scotland, I think the point at which which area of business has lead responsibility. And then there's the strategic framework, which I think we have covered. So this is in three parts, really. Any reflections from committee members to add? Nothing? Tom?
Chair, thank you. Reflecting on the conversation we had earlier, I'm happy to take that away and recast it in a way that we've heard very clearly about a clearer commitment to a framework around implementation planning. It's based on good practice and that we are committed to rolling out. So we'll recast that and then feed it back through to yourselves in whichever way is appropriate. Thank you.
I think that would be most helpful. Thank you. And if we link that with, we'll have some, just quite whether and how the committee is cited of this in any more detail than the usual method would simply be by assets reporting, X number of actions are complete, X number are not. I think we probably need a little bit more detail. Not I wouldn't suggest for May, which is almost hard upon us, but for maybe mid-year. I think that would be my suggestion. I see a nodding of heads and the raising of thumbs. So that seems very good. Is everybody content with that? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then the final objective, which is indeed an absolute unqualified green. The strategic plan has due regard to Scottish Government's strategic police priorities and other legislative requirements. So I think, and particularly if we are using the equality and diversity and violence against women as some of the next pilots, that will fit in very well with that as well as the board's priorities. So very positive indeed about that. Okay, thank you all very much indeed. And that's the first of three, although I suspect that the others will not take quite as long. But thank you very much indeed, Tom and Kirsty, Louise, and all members. That was a very valuable discussion indeed. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to the second of the internal audit reports, core financial systems, IFRS 16 preparedness, therefore. Gary, are you going to introduce this?
I think Andrew's going to take this one, Chair.
Okay. Andrew.
So taking the report as read, I think I'll quickly summarise the main points of the report and the main thrust. Per the scope that we've articulated in there, there's really two main organisational risks that arise from the introduction of a new accounting standard. The first is obviously the financial reporting risk, the ability of the organisation to collate and present accurate information in its financial statements for financial reporting purposes. The other side of it is the interaction with internal budgeting, internal approval, and the use of budget that's allocated by Scottish Government and the interaction with delegated expenditure limits. So on that first point, financial reporting, we had some really quite in-depth conversations with James and Alice's team. We found good awareness, strong knowledge of all the requirements that were there. What I think we were maybe not able to evidence as strongly as we would like was a coherent plan with kind of identified milestones and allocated responsibilities. So the focus of the finding is really just to formalise those things. When we went looking for the elements that we would have expected to be in such a plan, we found them. There were people who clearly had those roles, the information is being gathered, so on and so forth. So the groundwork is well in hand. It's just much more about being able to write down what needs to happen when, just to give a bit of additional assurance that the finance function can report and indeed provide assurance to this committee and others that work is all well in hand and that it's running to schedule. On the second point, the interaction with budgets and financial allocations, and particularly with the delegated expenditure limits, there's still an absence of formal guidance on this from Scottish Government. So what we looked at essentially was what information has the organisation collated to allow it to have that conversation and to deal with that guidance as and when it arrives. We didn't identify any issues in that context, and we saw good evidence of strong engagement of the Police Scotland finance team with Scottish Government in terms of identifying what those things were. There has been consideration throughout that of how that impacts upon internal processes, budgeting, so on and so forth. Some of that is dependent on the guidance that's published, but to the extent that decisions can be made about that, we find that they generally have. Final point I'll make about this report, and this is just one about the level of risk exposure and the risk ratings that we've applied. Obviously, we're doing this report at a point in time. This is a matter that will become riskier as time goes by, so as we get closer to implementation deadlines and so on and so forth. So I think it's important for the committee just to take the risk ratings and the gradings in that context. And that dovetails with the point I was making before about the ability of Police Scotland, the finance function, to give assurance that this work is well in hand and progressing as planned. That's probably all I'd say on it. Beyond that, it generally speaks for itself, but happy to take any queries on it, questions.
Thank you. I wonder, before I invite colleagues, or maybe invite James Gray to just any comments on the management actions, well, on the recommendations and the management action content.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Alistair is also here, and he may want to add to it, but I'm content that we know what we've got to do, and I think this was just a question of making sure that that was documented. You know, we have been rolling out training into different parts of the business and so on. So I think, you know, the commitments there in the management actions, and in some cases it's already been done around getting this documented. The only thing is, as Andrew was saying, that is for me up in the air, and even as recently as yesterday, Alistair and I were speaking to Scottish Government about what, you know, the treatment would be from a budgetary perspective. That's something that we continue to pursue, and I know we're waiting for a formal written response from government on that. But from the conversation we had yesterday, it does sound very much as though the Scottish Government in turn is waiting on Treasury, so they have a better idea about the accounting for it. But it is late in the day, and, you know, we were making the point about things like, you know, Osprey House and some of these leases that we're about to enter into, but without fully understanding yet what the budgetary implications might be, or certainly government not understanding what the budgetary implications might be for us. So it's something we continue to raise with government. So that, for me, that is the thing that gives me most concern at the moment, is that lack of clarity from the budgeting perspective. From the accounting perspective, I think we have documented what we need to document now, and we will, you know, be monitoring that on a weekly basis as we have done in previous years, by adopting that kind of project management approach to the preparation of the annual report and accounts.
Thank you. Alistair, anything you want to add for us?
Not very much. Just to sort of support what James has said, and really, you know, Andrew's first point about the planning, I think that was totally justified. The plans were there, but they were a little bit too informal, to be perfectly honest. I mean, this is quite a complex accounting standard, and greater rigor and detail in the planning is important. That's all in place now. We're having, well, we were having regular meetings anyway, but they're now more formalised as we get nearer to the 31st of March. But I suppose it's important to say, though, you know, this accounting standard doesn't really go live until the 1st of April. But we will be putting a report in the accounting policies notes this year related to where we stand at this point in time. The true accounting doesn't happen until the 1st of April. But, you know, that's not to say that we haven't done anything on that. Clearly, that is what the main emphasis of the work has been on. And as James was referring to, the discussion with the Scottish Government about budgeting, that's absolutely valid as well. And we did write to Scottish Government 6 months ago now, I think. And we have had informal responses from them, which actually were hugely helpful. But that's no substitute really for that formal response, which we really need. And as James highlighted, we did discuss that with them yesterday, and it was some comfort to know that we weren't the only people that were pushing Scottish Government for that kind of guidance, because it really does help. And I think it's probably the last point in the audit report about that's critical too. We kind of know what we're doing on that. We're pretty sure what the outcomes are going to be, but until we get that formal confirmation from the Scottish Government, we can't be absolutely certain. And we wouldn't want our budgets to be blown out the water with some false assumptions about how the capital element, for example, would be funded, or the funding would flow to us. That's probably the key point there. That was all I was going to say. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. So open this up for questions. Grant.
Thanks, Chair. It's not really a question, it's really just a comment. I just say I found it very helpful and reassuring to know that how much work you've done to be ready for the implementation of this standard. I know, wearing another hat, that implementation of IFRS 16 has been a real challenge across the public sector worldwide, and actually getting this standard introduced in the UK has had its challenges through the Treasury and rolling out into Scotland. So therefore, to me, I completely agree with the comments that have been made by James and Andrew about the whole question, Alistair, I mean, sorry, about the whole question of budgeting for the future, because it has quite an impact. It could potentially have quite an impact in some of the decisions that are taken as to whether to buy or lease different things going forward. That was all. Thank you.
Okay. Gillian, I'm so pleased you've got your hand up, because I was actually going to ask you, Gillian from Audit Scotland, if you had any comment or wanted to offer any comment or ask any questions. Gillian.
Thanks very much, Chair. So IFRS 16 is an important standard for financial reporting purposes, and the external audit is all about financial reporting. We've really welcomed, through our routine meetings with Alistair and James, being kept right up to date with preparations for a number of years now for the implementation of IFRS 16. So we also welcome that you commissioned an internal audit report to get an independence view on the preparations that you've had underway. So this is really insightful as well for us. Clearly, it doesn't have a direct implication for the financial position that will be reported this year end, but we know that you do have a disclosure about the likely impact for the subsequent year in this regard. I noted that there's a reference to best value in the report, and I was actually going to pick up a certain point that's in the longer term, but Grant's already made reference to it. The point about IFRS 16 is to have greater transparency of the commitments that you have for the acquisition of assets and for the use of those assets. And Grant's already alluded to it. You might, at a certain point in time, decide that you're not leasing. That's not the best value arrangement, but there might be outright purchase. And once again, major implications for both revenue and capital funding in the long term. So all of us finance professionals online as accountants and auditors have an interest in that, and we'll also be looking to what's evolving in the private sector that are ahead of us with respect to the implementation of this standard, to see if it has had any changes in behaviour for procurement decisions. But it's going to take a long time before we see that come out, but I think we're all alert to know that that is the consequence, and you've captured it under the well. The heading of best value will come in for a different reason in years to come in that regard.
Thank you. That's very helpful indeed, Gillian. But it's an indication of what we should be alive to now and the longer term aspects. Any other thoughts or questions, or are people content? Katerina, anything from you? No?
Nothing, thank you. Really
right.
good report and good good level of debate, I think.
Yeah, very helpful. Katrina, anything from you? No, I don't think so. Okay.
Sorry, no thanks. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Good report, good recommendations. And then our third internal audit report is on procurement, which is something we have looked at from time to time. So come back to us, it being a most important feature of Police Scotland, SBA, and indeed ARAC. So, Gary, is this one for you?
No, thankfully, this is one for Andrew again, Chair.
Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's probably important to just to touch on the context of this review, which is primarily that we carried out this following the award of the body-worn video procurement, and its resulting kind of lessons learned review and changes to process and so on and so forth. So in that context, the scoping of it was not an end-to-end review, a kind of compliance style review of procurement processes, but more to take a wider look at the ability of the organisation to demonstrate that it's achieving best value. And to that end, we focused the audit work really on higher risk, higher value procurements, particularly those that have taken place since that lessons learned review off the back of the body-worn video procurement. In the course of carrying it out, we have generally taken as the kind of applicable standards, Scottish Government best practice guidance and Audit Scotland best value toolkits and frameworks. We also, in the course of this, drew on our knowledge of procurement practice at other blue light organisations. They have similar procurement requirements to yourselves in that very often it's a matter of procuring kind of specialist and specific services. Generally, it's a pretty positive report. We didn't find any areas where we could look at the applicable guidance, the applicable standards, and see things that Police Scotland are not doing. Similarly, when we did our benchmarking exercise against peer organisations, we tended to find there wasn't anything that Police Scotland is not doing that was common practice elsewhere. We have raised a couple of findings here. These are similar in theme to what Police Scotland found through its own exercise, the lessons learned, and they relate to the use of technical guidance, expert guidance in the course of carrying out procurement exercise. The main point that we have drawn on there is that it would be useful to put more clarity around the process for making the decision whether or not to involve technical guidance, to what extent that needs to be applied to the sourcing strategy. Mm-hmm. There's, I think, a related point in there, which is to do with carrying out training needs assessments in the context of the restructure that the procurement function is undergoing at the moment. But generally speaking, the main conclusion here is that we didn't find any area where Police Scotland's practice diverged from good practice, best practice, what's articulated in the best value frameworks. Happy to take any questions on that.
Thank you. I think I had a question. I mean, it would be a rare internal audit that didn't find something. You might feel you were doing your job too, so it's as positive as one's going to get, really. Nevertheless, just that question on the bringing in of specialist support. Was it an issue primarily of clarity, consistency, having, you know, the checklist, as it were, of them and thing? Did you, maybe slightly out with the scope of the audit, but I just wondered if that was with a view to there was a lot of more specialist input than you would expect, or less specialist input than you would expect, or is it actually the degree you would expect is just not necessarily got that robustness of process around it, albeit the outcome may be appropriate?
I would say probably a little bit of both. The observation we raised essentially is that when we were looking at particular procurements, we could ask the question of the procurement function, did you consider risk assess this against any requirement for pulling in technical advice? Generally, we could get an answer, but the process doesn't clearly define who makes that decision, and it doesn't really require that the rationale for that decision is documented. So a little bit of both in that. Without that, it's quite hard to retrospectively look back at that and try and unpick that decision. But also there is the process element of it as well.
Okay, thank you. Maybe invite Ian to comment, because Ian, I think it lies with you on for overall control as well as the day-to-day. I know it's in your blood.
Certainly. So for us, we obviously is the kind of normal practice is we obviously look to like a technical user intelligence group. So we look to draw from the user or the technical expert within Police Scotland, and then really when you have those discussions going through the sourcing strategy, which covers off kind of key technical questions in there, then what really I think's been picked up here is naturally we would expect to draw that technical expertise out. And I think where we've all agreed there's a weakness is at what point does somebody state no, we don't need external support, or we do? And I think so. It's always debated and discussed, but there's no record of there's a decision and there's the point and there's who. So I think this is a cleaner way to do it, and it kind of mitigates that risk found within body worn video. Yeah, so I think that this is an improvement to the process without a doubt. But obviously, we've got great experience in covering this off in hundreds and hundreds of tenders. But I think this just obviously just helps support that mitigation of a potential risk.
Okay. Interesting to see if it results in a wildly different outcome. I would not expect so, because I would expect the decisions to have been the right decisions, but that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions, any comments? Are people content? Grant? Grant, you're on mute temporarily.
I do beg your pardon. I thought I'd stopped doing that. My apologies. I'm very glad Ian's on the call, because one of the things that we discussed at our recent resources committee was the capacity of procurement to be able to cope with the increasing demands on it. And I know that the report, the internal audit report, is extremely positive, and you probably were looking at specific examples, but one of the things that I think it'd be quite useful for Ian to comment on is the way forward. I know you're restructuring your team to be able to cope with increasing demands, because as the organisation goes forward over the next few years, the pressures on you and your team are considerable. And I think it would be remiss of us not to recognise that.
Yes, so thanks, Grant. In response to that, so we are just about to embark on the reorg. So I've been doing all the prep work, so we're about to present to JNCC and go forward with that reorg. And the key function of that is to have this, the kind of usual words, but it's to have this sustainable, capable, with capacity built in to the service to align to all the strategic objectives, and where does the service, the business, and the force want to get to. So we've obviously, from creating the procurement strategy, kind of followed that thread right through to say, well, we need to structure to do that. So yes, we've certainly had challenges because the structure we're still in right now is legacy, and that needs to be tidied up. But that's taken me a long time, unfortunately, with COVID and COP26 putting a hold in a lot of plans and other key work has delayed that slightly longer than I anticipated, but we're really at the cusp of kind of putting that in motion, and that should certainly build those kind of assurances in that we are ready to, for example, support that capital spending, support the kind of add value, because it's not just about, obviously the baseline is putting the tenders in place, and then we talk about the technical aspects of that and where can we add value through procurement exercises, where we can do more strategic agreements for the business, just to improve how everything flows through and how everything operationally works, even to our engagement with the users. That's both force officers and corporate services staff. So we've still got a lot to do to really make this a smooth operation that delivers against the real objectives of the procurement strategy and then the strategic objectives of the business. So a bit to go, and it's going to be several months for that reorg change to land, but it's all moving in the right direction, and they should deliver that sustainable, kind of assured progress.
Grant, content?
Yes, I just thought it was important to give Ian the opportunity to make these points.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks, Ian. I think that's very clear.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katerina, anything from you? No? Or Katrina? Just gone off my screen, but fine. Okay. That's thank you very much indeed. So 3 very different internal audit reports, but a good discussion on each of them. Thank you all very much indeed. So now we will move on to Audit Scotland's annual audit plan. Gillian, you've provided this for us, and that's very helpful. And I think that's one of the benefits of actually having the meeting at this time rather than waiting till May. So do you like to speak to it, highlight anything you particularly like to draw out?
Good morning. Thanks very much, Chair. And Chair, if I could just mention one thing with respect to the suite of internal audit reports, I'd just like to put on record how much I welcomed the cover paper as presented and prepared by officers. And I think that's really signals a change, which we'd recommended, and it's good to see it now. It's completely bedding in. So I think it indicates that management have taken responsibility for the reports and the content of internal audit. That's great to see. And also in the cover paper, the consideration of any implications, for instance, for equalities, that consideration is now demonstrably taking place by management. So just to say, I really welcome that step change. I think that's strengthening governance. So turning to our annual audit plan for the year 21-22 before you today. So this is year 6 of this audit appointment process. I hope it's flown by quickly for you too. So quite exceptional that it was for 6 years. As you know, we worked to a 5-year appointment process to ensure independence and objectivity, but COVID-19 held up the procurement process as we strive to maintain the balance that we have in Scotland, where 1/3 of the audits go to the firms. So turning to the content of the report, I know that members will be very familiar with the substance of the content, but a little bit more summarised, even more than previous years in that regard. You mentioned, Chair, what of significance to draw out, and really paragraph 1, the summary of our planned audit work. And you'll be familiar with the first 3 bullet points, and the 3rd bullet point, which is to do with the wider audit dimensions, are important, and we really welcomed and tuned in to the discussion about the important links between strategic and operational planning that you had earlier. The 4th bullet point about whole of government accounts. So members of the committee don't see a lot in connection with that, but there's a lot of work for officers and ourselves as auditors behind the scenes. You can imagine with your balance sheet, in particular your pension liability, means you're a very significant entity at a UK level for the consolidation of the accounts into the whole of government accounts. For the 1920 whole of government accounts process, the Scottish Police Authority's consolidation return and our audit thereof was selected for quality review by the National Audit Office, and extend our thanks to colleagues in finance, in particular Alistair, and also all of the work that Pauline did. It was really quite challenging because of the vetting process for any auditors looking at your, well, they weren't looking directly at your books and records, but they were looking at the results in our audit files. So that was quite a challenging episode for us all. And the whole of government accounts for 2021 has not commenced. So we await direction from HM Treasury. Audit Scotland has notified Treasury that to think about commencing it in August 2022, which is the current suggestion, is not a good idea. The audit resource in the United Kingdom is already very stretched, so to add that in is not going to be a good use of that time, but you can see it's not going to be particularly efficient with that delayed start to the 2021 whole of government accounts audit assurance process. So a little bit of reference still to COVID-19 impacting on our audit work, and we continue to work remotely, but we're pretty used to it now, and officers are very helpful for the sharing of all of the books and records through various IT facilities and arrangements we have in place. And page 4, a reference there to our respective responsibilities, but the important paragraph to draw out there, paragraph 10. So at some point during this year, concluding our audit, and a new audit team will be assigned, whether it's another in-house team or potentially one of the firms. But we'll work hard to smooth the transition arrangements to minimise the burden on particularly your finance officers that feel the burden of the external audit process. The next page, page 5, a reference there to the materiality levels that we work to. And then importantly for members of the Audit Committee, ARAC, page 6. This is us drawing to your attention as those charged with governance of significant risks of material misstatement that we've identified in the 21-22 audit. So I'm looking at Exhibit 2 there, and the first risk, number 1, that is a standard risk as dictated by international standards of auditing. So if you're the Audit Committee of British Telecom plc, you would be reading that same risk there. It is not a specific risk that we're identifying in SPA Police Scotland. The second one relates to also through the standards, we must consider whether there's any risk of material misstatement due to fraud and expenditure recognition. And there are 2 areas that have alerted us to ensure we carry out particular work in this area. You incur a material amount of non-pay expenditure, so we'll be designing our audit work accordingly, and you have a new P2P system in place. So we'll want to assure ourselves that the control design and application is effective in that regard. Our third area we mention is with respect to pensions. We know it's just a very significant figure, and the nature of the calculation involves a lot of assumptions. So we'll be looking closely at that. Those are the 3 areas identified of significant risk of material misstatement, and we're following our auditing standards and drawing that out, giving it such profile in the annual audit plan. Paragraphs 15 and 16 are quite complicated, but it's just to let readers know why we don't identify other aspects of income and expenditure as that significant risk of fraud. And then paragraph 17 onwards, these are other areas distinctive to the SPA audit where we will also be paying particular attention, but they don't come under the category of significance. So the valuation of property, plant and equipment, your legal provisions, and the pension account itself, which appears as a note to your accounts. And paragraph 18 reminds you the risk assessment process is iterative and a dynamic, and were anything else significant to come to light during this 21-22, we would be sure to let you know as members of this committee. The next section, Chair, audit dimensions and best value, areas that you're very familiar with and that we will continue to have an interest in, and in terms of reporting for this year. We've drawn out a little short reference to best value, and I really welcomed keeping right up to date with the interim accountable officer about the self-assessment process that the SPA has had underway in recent months. But Exhibit 6 draws out a couple of areas of significant interest to us that we will want to follow through. The financial planning arrangements that you have to assure yourselves with respect to sustainability, and also following through on workforce planning and benefits realisation. I'm very conscious, I know that you've got HMICS carrying out work there, so you'd want to ensure no duplication there, but we did want to keep it right up to date with that, because when it was published, the strategic workforce plan was very significant for a number of reasons, including financial sustainability. And again, I refer back to the earlier discussion about ensuring the good match between strategy and operational implementation plans. So we'll get more familiar with how that's progressing this year. We've got a section there with respect to reporting, timetable and audit fee, and my team and finance officers have stayed in close dialogue in order to strive to ensure the same pre-pandemic reporting deadlines of the 30th of September. And there's further detail at the various key stages in Exhibit 8 in that regard. You'll have noticed a slight increase in the audit fee in paragraph 31. I have to say all fees have increased slightly across our entire portfolio this year. It's our colleagues in audit quality and appointments that oversee all of the costs that are incurred, and then pitch the fees to ensure that we're working on a break-even basis from one year to another. We pay particular attention to all of the work of internal audits, so captured in paragraphs 33 and 34. We've drawn out a number of the key reports this year that we think will be important, in particular to do with our wider dimensions and getting assurances there. And finally, the sections on independence and quality control are very important from an auditing profession perspective. So a reminder that independence is assured because it's the Auditor General for Scotland that makes the appointments. It's not the Scottish Police Authority themselves that make that decision. And I can confirm the Institute of Chartered Accountants for Scotland are all over us at the moment with quality reviews underway. We've got a reporting deadline of the 31st of March, and I am the lead for Quality and Audit Services Group, so that's dominating quite a bit of our time. And so that's not just a so it's very real in our lives. So I'm joined by my colleague Pauline, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions. And then Jane, I do have a little bit more information to share with you about the audit team going forward after the question.
That was one of my questions, such as you could share things. No, that's all very straightforward, and we come on to our own our planning in order to meet these deadlines and match them. I wonder if there's just something you mentioned, HMICS and the work they're doing, particularly on workforce planning. You, tell us where you're going to be able to consider internal audit, and that's more, I think, than you've been able to consider before. So that's very positive. What's the relationship with HMICS? Is there any reliance or consideration, or what's the right expression there?
So from our perspective, we knew that this strategic workforce plan had really significant profile for a number of years, and I think back to the Section 22 reports and the emphasis that was placed there. And we paid particular attention, 138 pages on the appendices back in November 2020, but we didn't have it for a particular follow-up for 2021. It was too soon. Okay. So I think it was really good. I had the opportunity to chat with the interim accountable officer earlier this week, who was very much highlighting HMICS's role in all of this. So I think it's a much higher level that we're interested in finding out about how this is progressing, and we'll take cognizance of the work and the scope of HMICS to the extent that it's manifesting itself in reporting at that stage. So I just wanted to make sure we weren't duplicating or tripping over each other. But historically, we have had an interest in this area, so it's in that regard.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we're not, in fact, for this year, this reporting year, we're not, because of how it's progressing, we're not at a stage of reliance, but hopefully we might be next year. That would be a real positive. Okay, thank you very much. Questions, comments from colleagues? Grant, Katerina?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Gillian, I thought it was as usual, a very readable report, very clear as to what you're trying to do. I just wanted to make the point in relation to page 12 on workforce planning and benefits realisation. The workforce planning aspect, there's quite a lot of work going on in the People Committee to look at that, as well as the work that's been done by HMICS. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind. I think it'd be fair to say they're on a journey. There's quite a lot of work that's going to take a wee while to be complete, but they are certainly paying quite a lot of attention to what's going on in that area.
Okay, thank you. Katerina, anything from you?
I think Katrina has got her hand up, Chair, but
okay.
I mean, I'm also quite keen to hear more about the transition to the next to next external audit team.
Yeah, okay. And so before we do that, finally, Katrina?
Yes, thanks for that. I just wondered if it would be okay to ask you to just talk a wee bit more to the duty of best value, where you've got, we reviewed the best value characteristic, fairness and equality within the Scottish Police Authority, and we will consider any further developments. I just wondered if you could maybe clarify that a wee bit more.
Yes, absolutely. So you'll maybe be familiar with the best value audits that we carry out in a local government environment with the 7 best value characteristics. The former Auditor General for Scotland, Caroline, was very keen that we look particularly at the best value characteristic of, it was equality and then it became fairness and equality in all those bodies where the accountable officer has a duty of best value. So that's all central government and all NHS bodies. And so the planning guidance, the annual planning guidance about 3 years ago, instructed all local auditors to be carrying out fairly high level review of how those central government and NHS bodies were demonstrating compliance with this one best value characteristic that had been selected out of the 7. Katrina, this was part of Audit Scotland as a listed authority itself mainstreaming equalities. So it said at a strategic level, as we set our equalities outcomes, that we would be looking at equalities in public sector bodies and integrating it with our local audits. So it was quite a step change 3 years ago. For those familiar with it, in the annual audit report, where we did cover fairness and equality, there were quite a few findings, but an important recommendation that we made at the conclusion of it. I have to say at the time, there was a lot of material talking about all of the fora established internally in SPA and Police Scotland to demonstrate their commitment as a listed authority themselves to the Equalities Act and all the Scottish specific regulations and so on. But the one recommendation that we did have, similar to the discussion you've had earlier, was to ensure that what was put in place was defined outcomes which would enable monitoring and measurement of progress thereafter. So that's a recommendation from last year that we will be following through this year to see what has been put in place. But I'm very conscious of the discussion earlier and the emphasis, different strategies that you've been developing and the talk about using them. I've got notes of it all here to in particular pilot the follow through of the outcomes and the fulfilment of the objectives in that regard. And so our reports are as much about capturing what's happening across public sector bodies so that when Audit Scotland has an overview across all of these, it can see also emerging best practice in different areas. I mean, we were very conscious of the Elis Angelini report that was published not long after our annual audit report, but ours was obviously at a much higher level, light touch, relative to the breadth and the depth that particular report covered. So it's just in terms of managing expectations and our competencies in this area. But we now are covering, there's a reference to inequality in a lot of our outputs now. So there has been a step change.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you. I think that is helpful. I think that, as you say, referencing the earlier discussion we had, that shows how seriously we're taking it beyond that high level strategic that you're talking about, and the let's say particular projects or something, but actually we're hitting the middle ground there in terms of how we see the outcomes and how we can be assured of the outcomes. I think that's, and hopefully that will give you some reassurance, which may or may not, it will be relevant to this year's report. So, okay, good. Anything else from you? Gillian, and finally, you were perhaps going to give us a hint of what is to come.
So there's 2 levels of transition to break news to you about. And the first one's a bit of good news and a bit of bad news, and then something to balance it all up. I'm very pleased to see that my colleague Pauline Gillen, who's online today, Her skills and experience have been recognised in Audit Scotland, and she will now be operating as an audit director for the next few months in an acting up capacity in Audit Scotland with her own portfolio of clients. So at this point, we release Pauline from supporting me as Senior Audit Manager on the SPA audit. So I know that that's that's not easy territory, having this change midway through the 21-22 audit. So that's the bad news. But in the middle of all of this, we're pleased, Pauline and I are very delighted that our colleague Stephanie Harold will be joining us as the Senior Audit Manager for the remainder of the 21-22 audit. Stephanie having been lead Senior Auditor previously on this audit prior to her own promotion. So we sincerely hope that from James and Alistair's perspective, this is not going to feel overly disruptive, and it's really great for me and the team that we've been able to find this solution. So that's the first stage of change. And then the next stage of change is Stephanie and I and colleagues will be seeing this audit through to conclusion at the end of September 2022. But well in advance of that, you will know who your new external auditors are. Interestingly, 18th of March is an important date. It's my understanding that's the date when the firms are due to have returned their signed contract. So maybe I elaborate a little bit further. The invitation to tender went well. And somebody like Grant might be paying attention to the crisis in public sector audit south of the border, but we had a good response when we went out to tender. Affordability reviews have been carried out, conflict of interest reviews have been carried out, and there are now defined portfolios for each of the firms. And of course, they have to have a certain critical mass to invest in having a public sector audit team and so on. But that's all been underway. And as a consequence of those contracts being concluded, our internal colleagues in audit quality and appointments should shortly be in a position to reveal to the in-house team that the rest of the portfolio that will remain with the in-house team. And I imagine it will be in about April that there will be a communication strategy letting audited bodies know the likely, the preferred or the selected external auditor for going forward. Happy to respond to any questions you might have in that regard.
That's very helpful indeed, Gillian, because whatever the outcome is, but we have a meeting in May, so actually that fits very well. That should mean, I think from what you're saying, that as of the May ARAC meeting, we will be clear about who the team will be from September, but we have a continuity of the existing team to take us through the current preparation and hopefully signing off. Certainly, we're all definitely aiming for that September sign off. So yeah, that's hugely helpful. Thank you. Colleagues? No, well, congratulations to Pauline. I think perhaps we have contributed. Perhaps we are a springboard for promotion. Stick with us, and yes, well, excellent, well done. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so that leads very neatly actually onto the next, and I think one as final item on our own internal plan, that is Police Scotland and the SPA for preparation of the annual report and accounts. And John and Alistair, you've put this together. John, are you going to lead? Do you want to lead off on this?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I'll be brief.
We did have a bit of a discussion about it earlier, and hopefully you might have thought perhaps layering in a bit more detail might be helpful.
Yes, of course. Yeah, so this dovetails quite nicely on from Gillian's Audit Scotland plan for the year, showing our own combined SPA and Police Scotland plan for preparing the annual report and accounts. The key point of change that I would highlight from the previous year's work is that now SPA Corporate are taking much more direct ownership of the front end of the accounts than we have done in the past, and that's really just a factor of embedding now the new SPA structure. But we'll be working and relying very closely with Alistair and the rest of the Police Scotland finance team. The timeline, as you say, is very high level. It shows the key touch points in the plan, which we'll be monitoring against, and underneath that's a lot more detail. As you say, Chair, there are a couple touch points which I'll maybe just pick up which aren't in that plan, just regarding members' interactions on the area itself. So firstly, picking up on ARAC, there's an immediate role later on in this committee about evaluating committee effectiveness, and we'll conclude on that later in the year, which will feed into the governance statement. Later in May, ARAC will see an update on how we're progressing with the plan. And then what we're intending is that off table will provide ARAC members with early sight of the draft front end once it's been approved by the accountable officer. Finally, in July, ARAC will actually see the full draft ARA prior to its approval in September. Just picking up on some of the other committees, Resources Committee will have a key role in considering the financial outturn, and they'll see the draft in their next meeting. And then, of course, PPC have a very important role that will consider the draft financial performance, the performance report for the Scotland Forensics and SP Corporate, which will all feed into the area itself. As I said, we'll be working really closely with Alistair, so I don't know if there's anything further that Alistair or James would like to add.
I mean, nothing really to add, John. I think that was pretty clear and comprehensive. I mean, maybe just to say that, you know, this is now a pretty tried and tested formula, and we've got a very detailed plan, as John mentioned, behind this that we build on each year. We've had probably a more detailed and more productive lessons learned process this year than we've had previously. So that's all now built into the plan, and I don't doubt that we will learn again from this year and build it into next year's. But that's all behind there. So you know, there's a lot of detail, and also to give assurance that it's actually already underway. So we've already started some of the work, particularly with reference to the certificates of assurance process. So that's already well underway. And some of those things have been ticked off now. So yeah, I don't think very much to mention. I mean, John's already referred to the fact that there's a change in emphasis this year with the ownership for the performance report and the accountability report moving more formally over to the SPA, and I think that's helpful because I think last year there was a bit of a false accountability sort of around it, really, and it didn't particularly help. I mean, it was absolutely fine. We worked very well and very constructively together, but it didn't. There was a lack of clarity, I think, and we've got that now. So I think that was clearly one of the lessons learned, and I think an improvement for this year. Let's make things a bit more streamlined. That was all I was going to say to add to what John said.
Thank you. One additional point, I think, as I say, layering in a bit more detail. You've referred to about the committee effectiveness of this, but what I'd really like to do, if we possibly can, in May, and it's not actually in this plan yet, but in May's ARAC should bring together ideally all of the committee statements of assurance, and certainly it is in schedule that we will have the internal audit report from assets. We're now, as you say, tried and tested. We've now got that into the right timeline. So that will be very useful, because I think by May we will should have most, if not all, of the assurances, the internal audit, and some first early sight, as you say, possibly off table, possibly in private, but around how the annual report itself is shaping up. Any questions, queries from colleagues? Katerina, anything from you?
Well, I think the plan makes sense as such, and it is good. It is good, I suppose, to have the discussions, Chair, as you've just alluded to. It's really good to have some of the discussions as front loaded as possible, so that we can take whatever commentary comes into account. So nothing substantive from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Katrina, anything from you?
No, I don't think so. I really like the simplicity of this report. It's very clear. Thank you.
Okay. And Grant, anything from you?
Thanks. Just one query in relation to, I see that the draft ARA goes to Audit Scotland on the 20th of June, and that's really before this committee's seeing it at all. So I think since it's quite a heavy read, I think trying to think through how best this committee can receive things at the right time, so that we can give any relevant input at the appropriate time is important. But I don't have anything specific.
Which I think is what we were trying to do, get to have some sighting of it before it went absolutely, albeit we will formally consider it in July and then September. Gillian, anything from you? I think those, hopefully those mesh together quite well. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed. And that brings us to the end of the public session. So we will